Hi, in this lesson we're going to be talking all about prorations. And you might wonder why I have a tire in that picture there. Well, the reason is that mileage on tires is often prorated when we don't get the full mileage out of it. So that's one of most people's first experience with a proration. So a proration is really an apportionment. And what we're going to be talking about with prorations here typically deals with taxes and sometimes interest and sometimes as well rents. So let's go ahead and get into these prorations. And in another lesson we may have seen this example of a tax proration, and this will just give you an idea of what a proration is all about. So let's say we have a transaction which is going to close on April 30th, but the seller owes taxes from January 1 through April 30th. And since the tax bill is not going to become due until October of that year, the buyer is going to get that tax bill. So it would be unfair to charge the buyer or have the buyer pay for the full year's worth of taxes when the seller owned the property for the first 4 months. So what we do is we do a proration. And in this particular circumstance, the seller at closing would be charged for those 4 months, for January 1st through April 30th. And that would appear as a charge to the seller on the seller's closing statement, and it would also appear as a credit to the buyer on the buyer side of a closing statement. That way the buyer has been given that money, and when the tax bill comes, the buyer will have, in essence, that money in his or her pocket to pay the taxes that the seller actually owed. So let's take an example. How much would the seller owe the buyer if the annual tax is $1,200? Well, let's see. $1,200 divided by 12, that's $100 per month. And the seller owes for 4 months, so that would be $400. And in this particular circumstance, the seller then would be charged $400 and the buyer credited with $400. Now, when we do prorations, there are certain rules that we have to follow. First and foremost, sometimes a year is quoted as a 360-day year versus a 365-day year. So if the question tells you to use a 360-day year, then all months, regardless of which month it is, happen to have 30 days. Now, if it's a 365-day year, which is more common, then you actually have to calculate the actual number of days in each month. Another question that you have to be aware of is who pays for the day of closing. And on the real estate exam, the test will tell you, the question will tell you who is going to be charged for the day of closing. Is it going to be the buyer or the seller? Please make a note for yourself. If a question doesn't specify who is going to be charged for the day of closing, then the buyer is the one who would be charged, because the buyer takes over the benefits and the responsibilities of the property from and including the day of closing. But again, most of the times the question will say that the buyer pays for the day of closing or the seller pays for the day of closing. Now, I want you to remember how to do these calculations. And actually, calculations for prorations could be done in a number of different ways. But we have here the Hoagy Way. That's my way. All right, so here's the rules relative to the Hoagy Way. The first thing that you need to do is draw a timeline. You want to lay the problem out so you can visualize it. So take a few minutes and draw a timeline and label it. Secondly, this next step is to find the number of days used, or find the time used, but typically that boils down to the number of days. Third, find the cost per day. How many dollars or cents per day will be charged to the buyer or to the seller? The next step is to find the prorated amount for the days used. So what you do is you take the days used that you've calculated, and you multiply that by the cost per day, and that gives you the proration for the days used. And that is oftentimes the answer that the question is looking for. However, what if the question said that the taxes, for example, had been prepaid, so we're really going to deal with the time unused, then what we would do, if it was for the unused days, is we would then subtract a proration for the used days that we calculated from the total cost. And we'll have an example of this in just a minute. So here's one example. Taxes for the year are $1,824 and have not yet been paid. If closing is on June 7th, what amount will be charged to the seller? Let's assume a 360-day year and that the buyer is responsible for the day of closing. So step one in the Hoagy method is to draw a timeline. So taxes are always January 1st through December 31st, and the closing date is June 7th. And we're looking for the amount of time used, and the seller is going to be charged for that time used. Now, first step after the timeline is to find the time used. So we have January through May. Remember, closing is June 7th here. So we have full months, January through May. And since the question told us use a 360-day year, each of those months has 30 days. So we have 150 days for those 5 months, plus we have June 1st through June 6th, or 6 days, totaling then 156 days used. Now the reason we did not include June 7th as a day was because, again, the question tells us that the buyer is responsible for the day of closing. Now, we found the days used. Now let's find the cost per day. We take the annual taxes and we divide it by 360 days per year. So that's $1,824 divided by 360. That gives us a cost per day of 5.0666 cents per day. Now let your calculator do the work here. Don't round that number. But we'll see what happens if you round the number there in just a minute. To find the prorated amount, the final step is the cost per day times the time used. And we take that $5.0666 times 156 days, and that gives us our answer, the proration of $790.40 that we're going to charge the seller. Now, what if we did round that 5.0666 up to $5.07 per day? If we did that, our answer would be slightly different. It would be $790.92 to charge the seller versus the answer we got on the previous screen, which was $790.40. So here's my recommendation. Always let the calculator do the work until you get the final answer. So don't round in the middle of the problem. Now let's take a few proration problems and solve them. Number one, a property with unpaid annual property taxes of $1,095 is sold. What amount would the seller be charged if closing was July 20th? Use a 365-day year and assume that the seller is responsible for the day of closing. So we've got a 365-day year here, and the question becomes how many months or how many days in each one of those months. Well, here's our timeline. January 1st through December 31st is taxes, and closing is July 20th. We need to find the time used, and we're going to charge the seller for that time because taxes are unpaid. So how do we find the number of days here in this 365-day year? Well, some of you may remember this little, it's not really a poem, but it's close to a poem. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except February, which is 28, a leap year 29. Well, first of all, they're never going to go into a leap year on the examination, so eliminate that from your thinking. Another way to remember this, someone told me this a long time ago, is the Knuckle Rule. The Knuckle Rule. Now let me show you what the Knuckle Rule is. You hold your hand in a fist, and then you point to your knuckle and the spaces in between. There's January, February, March, April, May, June, July, and then you stay on that August, September, October, November, December. Now what's that all about? Well, the knuckle rule means that every time you hit a knuckle, that month has 31 days. The in-betweens, the spaces in between your knuckles, have either 30 days or in the case of February, 28. So let me see. January 31, February 28, March 31, April 30, May 31. June, I couldn't think of June. June 30, July 31, then stay on that one, August 31, September 30, October 31, November 30, December 31. There, I got through it. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to. So that's the knuckle rule. However, you want to remember it. Please remember that if you're using a 365-day year, you actually have to have the exact number of days. Now, in the real world of escrow companies, they use their computers and they just put in the day of closing and the computer calculates the number of days automatically. So January, 31, etc., all right, all the way through the end of the year. So rather than remember that, probably the knuckle rule or that little poem is the way to do it. So let's go back to our question. We have closing on July 20th, and we need to find the amount of time used. And January through June 30th happens to be, when you add them up, is 181 days. And that's another thing you should remember. The first half of any year, using a 365-day year, the first half is 181 days. So if the question is, as this one is, July or afterwards, then you can always just remember the first 6 months is 181 days. So for July, we have 20 days, and now we're including the day of closing, charging the seller, because the question says the seller is charged for the day of closing. So we have a total amount of 201 days used. That's our second step. Third step, remember, is find the cost per day. So we take the annual tax, which is $1,095, we divide it by 365, and in here we get exactly $3 per day. So our cost per day is $3, and then the proration for the time used, we multiply that by the cost per day, 201 times $3 per day. Our proration is $603, and we charge the seller. And on the closing statement, we would have a charge of $603 to the seller, and we would have a credit to the buyer of the same $603. Now, the only way that you can do these and be successful with these is to practice. So we've got a few other examples here. But remember the rules. A lot of times people forget to do or neglect to do the timeline. Follow those Hoagy steps and you'll be in good shape. So let's look at the second example. What amount is credited to a seller who has prepaid $630 in annual real estate taxes if closing is June 15th? Assume a 360-day year and the buyer is charged for the day of closing. So first step, let's draw our timeline. Closing is June 15th, but now we're going to be concerned with the unused portion because the taxes have been prepaid for the full year. So we're going to have to calculate the time used, and we're going to charge the seller for that, but in the end we're going to wind up crediting the seller for the unused portion. Next step, find the time used. So January through May is 150 days, and we've got June 15th, but we're only going to charge the seller for 14 days because, again, the question says the buyer is charged for the day of closing. So we have a total then of 164 days used. Now let's find the actual cost per day. $630 divided by 360 days in the year, our cost per day is exactly $1.75. And now the proration for the charge to the seller, we multiply the 164 days used times $1.75, that gives us $287 charged to the seller. Is that the answer to the question? No. Why? Because it says again the taxes have been prepaid for the year. So since they've been prepaid, we're going to have to find the difference. So we subtract the charge to the seller from the annual tax. So that's $630 minus $287. That gives us a credit to the seller of $343. Now, a couple of points to make here. First of all, these examples are not multiple choice questions, but I can promise you that if this was a real test question, one of the other answers would be $287. In other words, the amount that we would have charged the seller, that the seller had used up, so to speak. But you have to remember the question is asking for the amount that would be credited to the seller because these taxes have been prepaid. Secondly, when we have this prepaid situation, some of you might want to just jump ahead and find the time for the prepaid portion. Well, you're on your own if you do that, because we could teach it actually 4 or 5 different ways. But the Hoagy Way, as I mentioned, is the way that we want you to approach these. So when you have a problem where the taxes have been prepaid, always find the time used and the taxes for the used portion, and then subtract it out from the total annual tax to get the unused portion. Now, we have one other proration example or problem here we want to look at, and this one deals with interest on a loan. So, a property is sold with settlement on October 19th. The loan balance of $80,000 with interest at 8% per annum is being assumed by the buyer, who will make the November 1st payment. So we have a loan assumption here. If the October 1st payment has been made, what is the seller's charge for the proration of interest? Assume a 365-day year, and the seller is charged for the day of closing. Okay, this is a little bit different. So let's take a look at our timeline here. The October 1st payment has been made, and remember from our financing discussion in a previous lesson that interest is always paid in arrears. You don't pay interest in advance, you pay interest in arrears. So the payment on November 1st that the buyer will make, as the question tells us, that payment includes principal and interest, but the interest is for the month of October. And since closing is on the 19th of October, then we're going to have to charge the seller for the interest for that period of time. The seller owes interest for those days, for those 19 days. So here's our timeline, and we have to find the time used, and it's simply 19 days because it says the seller is charged for the day of closing. Now, next step is to find the actual cost per day, but in order to do that, we have to find the amount of interest. So, the loan is $80,000 that the buyer is assuming. At 8% annual interest, that would be $6,400 annual interest. But we're only going to charge the seller for so many days, so we have to find the cost per day. We divide that by 365, and we get $17.53 as the daily interest. Now what do we do with that? Well, we do what we've done in all the problems. We take that daily interest of $17.53 and we multiply it by the 19 days the seller owes, and that gives us $333.07, the interest proration which would be charged to the seller. It also would be credited to the buyer. Why? Because the seller's taking that money and giving it to the buyer, because that interest is going to be paid by the buyer on the November 1st payment. So that's the way prorations are done. You'll have some other problems dealing with prorations down the road, but I would suggest maybe you want to review some of this video a second time just to get a good feel for these problems. Take your calculator out and go ahead and punch some buttons so you become familiar with these. I can almost guarantee you that you're going to get a couple of proration problems on your final examination and on your state licensing exam. So pay attention to these prorations. Remember the Hoagy rules. You draw a timeline. you calculate the number of days used, you find the cost per day, and then you multiply the time by the cost per day to get the prorated amount as the charge to the seller. And then if the problem says that the taxes, for example, have been prepaid, then you would subtract the charge to the seller from the total amount to get the credit to the seller. So again, look over these proration problems once more, and I think you'll find that it'll be helpful to you.